Well, let's move on to the crisis itself. Where are we now? I was wondering today. I read on the White House website that Joe Biden added another $800 million to the Ukrainian aid, or adding it up to 2 billion since his administration started. I was wondering what kind of narrative do you tell the Americans in order to support this kind of spendings?
Well, there is fortunately one statesman in the United States and Europe who has laid out, a person of a high political figure who has made a very sensible statement about how you can solve the crisis, namely by facilitating negotiations instead of undermining them, and moving towards establishing some kind of accommodation in Europe, maybe in which there are no military alliances, but just mutual accommodation. He didn't say it, but it's something like what George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, not the second, proposed in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, proposed what they called a partnership for peace, which would be open for Europeans generally, Eurasians as well. It wouldn't eliminate NATO, but he would live up to the promise that NATO would not expand to the east, firm promise to Gorbachev, keep to that, allow NATO there, but kind of de-emphasize it so other countries could join, including Russia for that matter, join the Partnership for Peace. Tajikistan joined, for example, not NATO, and move towards a world, a Europe, Eurasia with no military alliances. Actually, de Gaulle had similar vision. Emmanuel Macron, in his initiatives trying to contact Putin, suggested something similar. So going back to the one Western statesman, he didn't mention all of this, but he suggested something similar. Move towards negotiations and diplomacy instead of escalating the war. Try to see if you can bring about an accommodation, which would be roughly along these lines. His name is Donald J. Trump, the one statesman I know of in the West. Not my favorite person, incidentally, but let's tell the truth. He's the one person who said it, and it's the right way out. Others have said it too, but not in high positions.
Well, what I'm trying to ask is if you spend so much money on Ukraine and there are so many internal problems in the United States. We have education, transportation, healthcare, and you spend so much money abroad. How, what kind of story do you tell your citizens so that they support you?
That's where manufacturing consent comes in. You have to whip people into hysteria so that the only thing in mind is to destroy the enemy who is the ultimate evil. If you can get people whipped into that kind of hysteria, you can pour money into armaments and forget the domestic policies. It's an old story. Let's go back to World War One. Okay, World War One. Every country, the intellectuals led the country into hysterical denunciation of the enemy and talk about their glory of their own country. In Germany, the famous manifesto of 94 leading intellectuals who addressed the West and said, we're the country of Kant, Goethe, Beethoven, center of civilization. We are now defending civilization against wild monsters in the West. In England, the same thing. France, the same thing. There were a couple of people who objected. The overwhelming mass of the intellectual community was mobilized in patriotic enthusiasm and hatred of the enemy. In the United States is an interesting case. The British, of course, wanted the United States to come into the war, so they established what they called a Ministry of Information.
Yes.
Which of course meant Ministry of Disinformation, which concocted tales about German barbarity, the Huns doing this, tearing Belgian babies to shreds and so on. And they fed this to American intellectuals who lapped it up. Intellectuals of the liberal intellectuals of the John Dewey circle had whipped the country into such hysteria, anti-German hysteria, that the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, for example. And everyone went to war with enormous enthusiasm to kill the hated Germans. Well, it was an outcome to the war. Germany was defeated. What did the great statesmen do? They decided to crush Germany. It's defeated, let's crush it. That gave us someone named Adolf Hitler. That's not always the case. Let's go back a century before then, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, the French armies had virtually conquered Europe. They were finally defeated in 1815. There was a conference, international conference, set up the Concert of Europe. And the people who ran the conference were not nice people. I would not want to have Metternich as a friend, but they were statesmen. So they brought defeated France into the Concert of Europe, an accommodation with defeated France. That led to a century of peace in Europe, not entirely, but virtual peace. Very unusual period in Europe's savage, monstrous history. But there was a century of virtual peace by integrating the defeated aggressor into the settlement. After the First World War, no, let's crush them and bring on Hitler. Well, there's some lessons we can learn from that if we want to.